to the mid-Sunday of November. This weekend is our readings from the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, and some selected verses from that chapter. From Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 5, and the first few verses of that chapter. And finally, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25. Well, as we mentioned, this is bringing us now to the end of the Matthean year. Next week will be the last reading from Matthew. And today, in Matthew's story, he presents another parable. Remember that last week we had the parable of the 10 wise or unwise, depending on which ones you choose, maidens. This parable, again, picks up on the same idea of being prepared and using things wisely and well. Presents the parable of the talents. Now, this particular parable is found also in the gospel tradition according to Luke. And in that gospel, there are a number of similarities in the way in which the parable is presented, but there are also some interestingly to look at points of view which belong to Matthew. Now, in Matthew's writings, this is his longest parable, and as we mentioned last week and mention again today, that often an interpretation of this parable has taken on allegorical aspects, and therefore what we would call, use a nickel Greek word, eschatological concerns, namely looking toward the coming of Jesus in glory, which by this time, as Matthew is writing, is now understood to be something which is not as imminent, as we mentioned last time, as the early Christian churches seem to have been expecting. What is this parable? The parable of the talents. Now, to begin with, and we're going to start with the traditional interpretation of this, which tends to take on allegorical aspects, as I mentioned, and is often the way in which it is presented in homilies and sermons, and does make some sense. But it begins with an understanding of a talent. Now, as we will see, the allegorical interpretation understands talent to be an ability. You know, we say we have so many talents. Someone has the talent to be an artist. Someone has the talent to be a good speaker. Those certainly are important understandings of talent. But in the parable, a talent, in both Luke's version and Matthew's, is a sum of money. It is something worthwhile. It is, if you want, a measure of, the measure varies here, of weight, anywhere from 50 to 80 pounds. So a talent could be kind of large, even if you thought in terms of size. And the value of a talent would often vary depending on when it was used, how it was used, etc. But the bottom line seems to have been that a talent was always considered to be, keeping in mind that it had a monetary value of significant worth. So different writers will interpret the value of a talent much differently depending on where they want to go with it, I think, sometimes. Now, the story, of course, is that a master is going away. And in Matthew's story, he's just going away out of town somewhere. And he gives to 3 of his servants or slaves talents. And he gives them proportionately, 10 to one, 5 to another, and 1 to a third. and then he takes off, okay? Now, I don't know, maybe in years to come we'll look at Luke's version. In Luke's version, each of the three guys get the same amount of talents. But here, there's a difference, and this leads to the interpretation that is frequently made of this particular parable. When he comes back, that is, the master, he now calls the servants, and the one who has 10 has gained 10 more. And the owner, the master, rewards him by giving him authority over 10 cities, 10 places, and says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." To the one who had received 5, he too says, "I have gained 5 more," and the master is pleased with that and gives him a reward. Now we come to the third fellow who had the 1, and he says to the master, "I knew that you were kind of a hard and difficult man, and so I buried my talent, and here it is, and I give it back to you." And the master is disturbed by that, saying, "Why did you not use this more wisely?" And really gets kind of almost nasty, throws him out, and thus the message seems to be, use the talent that you have received. Now, it is true that perhaps the master did not expect anything. From an allegorical point of view, he gave these talents to his servants. He wanted them to use them. He perhaps did not expect a monetary return, but was surprised, and therefore for that reason would give appropriate rewards to them for the use that they had made. But for the third fellow who does nothing, well, he does something. To say he does nothing is incorrect. But to say, what does he do? He buries the talent, and then when the master returns, brings it out and gives it back. So he hasn't taken anything away from the master, but he also has gained nothing from it. And for that reason, he gets, punished, actually. Now, the problem here somewhat with this interpretation is God like this master here? And does he turn out now to punish someone who doesn't use their talents? And sometimes you can see allegorically interpreting this. Who is the master? Is Jesus. What are the talents, the abilities that we have? How have we used them or not used them? And some kind of gratuitous or gracious reward is given when the master returns. That has been for a long time the way in which this parable has been interpreted, and you can hear wonderful homilies and sermons about using the gifts or the talents that you have received wisely, and that not that you get rewarded in the end, but certainly manifest an appreciation for the gifts that one has received from God. So you see, it isn't necessarily that you're earning something, getting credit, but rather that you are appreciating by your use of the talent the gift that you have received. So all of that makes for a nice little homily. However, let's go back to the fact that the talent is worth something, that it is a unit of measurement of money, of goods. Now, we live in a society in which use of money certainly then as now would be important. So put it now into that perspective. The owner comes back, the master of the slave, and the one who has received 10 has gained 10 more. And so now the owner really walks away not only with the 10 he gave, but with 10 more. Makes your arithmetic can be simple, 20, okay? And says, very good, you have helped me out, you have helped the estate out. To the one who received 5, he says, I got 5 more, so 5 and 5 is 10. And again, you can see the owner, because it's all about money sometimes. Thank goodness that's not true in our time. But is rewarded for having increased the amount of money available to the master. Now we come to the third guy. The third guy hasn't, as we see here, hasn't done anything but bury it, now gives it back. The owner is not losing anything, but he's also not getting anything in return, and for that, the guy gets punished. In the allegorical interpretation, the hero is the owner who gives to each of the servants these talents. What if we now look at it from a different point of view? May we perhaps look at this parable as the third man not being a victim who is afraid, as he says to the master, to use his talent because he knows the owner, and it's important to listen. The owner is a man who does whatever he wants and sometimes even takes from others. So what if we now look at the third man not as the victim but as the hero? Because what he does is to not take advantage of anyone. Now, what's important here, I think, is to understand the economic system of the ancient world, which believed in the system of what we would call today limited goods. Now, today we live in a very different frame. So if you need another $1 billion, well, the government or whoever it is just kind of goes and gets it and throws it deeper in debt because there is always more out there to get. It's unlimited goods. But in the first century world, it's about limited goods. Let me give an example of what I mean. That in saying that there is only so much money or possessions. Take, for example, that you have $1. Now, what if you look at this? So to the first he gives 10 cents. To the second he gives a nickel. To the first he gives a penny. If the first man increases his 10 by another 10, somebody else is losing money because there's only so much money to go around. There's no more money than that $1 or those 10 pennies. So if somebody gets 10 more pennies, somewhere along the line, someone else is losing. And if you think of it, and that was often the way in which things worked in the ancient world, who lost out? Not the rich, but rather the poor. So somewhere along the line, for every penny, if you just use this analogy, that is increasing, the man with the 10 or the 5, some other group or person is losing. And so with that in mind, the servant who buried the coin now says, I will not engage in that kind of dealing. I will not literally rob or take away from the poor, who mostly are the ones who are going to lose out on this, but here's your money back. I haven't misused it. I haven't done anything wrong with it. I was afraid, but what was his fear? Is his fear of the master, or is his fear that in increasing the money for the master, which he already has enough anyway, perhaps, his fear is that he will be hurting or harming fellow human beings who also need that money and those goods to survive. And so perhaps, from this point of view, and there's what I'm suggesting, the man who buried the money is really the hero. And the parable issues a warning to the rich to stop exploiting the poor. And so here now emerges really a kind of hero. And when you take this kind of stance, unfortunately, often you pay the price. And that's what happens to this servant or slave. He pays the price of not doing what certainly in a certain way, in this case, the master expected. He expected his money to increase, his goods to become more, and now he's disturbed when it does not. So that makes this parable rather interesting, doesn't it? that maybe sometimes we need to, this interpretation, by the way, which is supported now by a number of interpreters or scholars who look at this particular parable, see that there is something more at work here, and this may be closer to a position that Jesus would have taken rather than the more popular interpretation of talents being abilities. Well, we're still going to always live with that a talent is an ability. No one questions that. But what would make this gospel parable challenging, you see, the first, the talent, use your talents, well, that's not terribly challenging. But this is challenging, to take the position of the third man and to stand against the rich and the way in which they were exploiting others requires not fear, but courage. And in that sense, this might well have been the kind of message as the community is getting ready to receive Jesus as he comes in glory, that indeed he could stand before the throne and say, I did what I could to help all of your people, all of my brothers and sisters. So there is a way to look at now the parable of the talents, the ability, the gifts, and in either way you look at it, a talent is a gift, either a gift that is spiritual or a gift that is material and practical. I want to just quickly comment on the second reading from the letter of Paul to the Thessalonians. You remember last week we ended kind of quickly pointing out that in the 4th chapter of that letter, Paul was encouraging his community at Thessalonica to not worry about the fact that those who had died before the coming of Jesus in glory, and again that expectation, as we mentioned, was quite popular at the time, not to worry about that, but that they too would share in the resurrection of Jesus. That, in fact, remember how the story verse kind of worked out, that the dead would rise first, and then the living would come up together, and all would meet Jesus in his glorious coming. So the reading this week in chapter 5 is an extension of that discussion that we heard last week. Some feared, as we heard, that the dead would be at a disadvantage when Christ returned. And so, once again, Paul assures the believers that they will be with the Lord and that they need, and here's what he hopes that will happen in the community, that they will encourage one another, that they will see the importance of continuing to prepare for the glorious coming of Jesus. Here, Paul is not so interested at this point about what is going to happen in the future, but the message, as we heard it this time, is how the community should act in the present. And he says, I don't need to write to you about this because I know what you're doing. It's kind of, this is typical of Paul, sometimes flatter people a little bit. And as much as they say they don't like to be flattered, let's face it, people do. And so he says, I know how you would act. I know that you would do these things, namely that you would support and help one another, that you would continue to do this. And even though the return of the Lord is now delayed, and maybe even the return of the Lord that delay is somewhat indefinite, don't lose that enthusiasm that you have of being prepared for the coming of the Lord. Don't become comfortable, also, Paul says, in the present age. So here, perhaps, is a message for our time. The values of our time are important, but let them not determine, ultimately, the values by which we, as the community of believers in Jesus, seek to live. Let us always evaluate those values of contemporary society, but let us also bring to them the ongoing message that Paul frequently will say throughout his letters. Certainly he alludes to this a little earlier in this letter, the values of kindness, of generosity, of support, of care for one another. So that is kind of the message that I would suggest you would find in the fifth chapter, rather, of the letter of Paul. This to the Thessalonians. This is a shorter letter, as you can see. This is the last chapter. And as we mentioned earlier on when we talked about the Thessalonian letter, this is the last time now that we will be hearing this publicly on Sunday. Next week we shift to someone a little differently. Be the community that I know you are and that you can be and continue to will be. So it's a message of encouragement and of support. And if, kind of subtly, he says, and I hope to come to visit you just to back this up. But if I don't, I'll know you continue on with it. The first reading at this time comes from the book of Proverbs. Now, a proverb, you remember, is a pithy saying. We, in our own time, have a series of them. Many of them can be found, for example, in Ben Franklin. You remember was known for this in his almanac. He gave all these little phrases. A stitch in time saves nine. The only trouble with the stitch in time saves nine is that many young people don't know what we're talking about. But those of you who sew or fix things know that if you have a rip, if you fix it right away, you're all set. If you let it go, what happens is the rip continues to get longer and longer. Hence, a stitch in time saves nine. So you can see Proverbs have what we would call proverbial wisdom. They come from learned experience, not so much simply from books, although you could write them down, but more importantly, this is kind of an oral tradition that's passed on to young people as they're growing up by older people, and hopefully they listen and follow that, and just in our time how they do, but anyway. The proverb book is attributed to Solomon. Now, Solomon is connected with the wisdom tradition because there were many stories in the book of Kings that talk about the wisdom of Solomon. We all remember, I think we mentioned this before, Solomon was known for wisdom, the famous baby story about how there were two women with each had babies. One night, they lived together, these two women. One night, one of the babies died. The next morning, one of the women came and said, "While I was asleep last night, that woman got up, exchanged babies, and the dead one was hers, but now she gave it to me, and I wanted to get mine back." Well, how does Solomon solve this? You remember, he says, "Well, bring the live baby, and I'll give each of you half of it," and says, "Cut it in half." Well, the mother of the live baby says, "No, no, no, give it to her." And Solomon says, "It's yours," see? So this is the famous story of the wisdom of Solomon. And the wisdom tradition, which is a later tradition in Old Testament or Hebrew literature, begins around the 2nd century before the common time, although certainly some of the stories and sayings were much older. But this is a tradition now which begins to write some of these things down. In our tradition, there are a number of books that belong into what we call the wisdom tradition. In the Hebrew tradition, they are simply called the writings, because they like to put things into three, and apparently we like that too. So they said, that is, the rabbis said, well, when you look at the Hebrew Bible, let's see that there are the historical books, there are the prophetic books, and then we have books that don't fit into either of those, so we simply call them the writings. But we, in the Christian tradition, particularly in the Catholic tradition, call the Proverbs part of the wisdom tradition. Now, and the reason for writing these sayings down apparently was to educate young men who were destined to move into positions of authority in the future. Admittedly, this is a kind of patriarchal approach here. These sayings were for sons of well-to-do men, and girls, ladies, sorry, you're out of this mix. But I mention all of this because chapter 31 of the book of Proverbs is a unique poem that is tacked on to the end of this book. And it is a poem on the nature of the strong woman, the ideal wife. And the ideal woman, of course, would be a woman of wisdom, and it's praise. But unfortunately, there's subtlety here in which what is now going, and you can, the section that we hear this week in reading really dissects the whole chapter. The whole chapter, and I invite you to look at this, 31 verses. Well, Proverbs decide to give you only a couple here and there, and thus when you eliminate or add things, you also eliminate. In this case, you're really adding an interpretation, aren't you? So you might want to look at this. But it's a wonderful tribute to what a good woman should be. She gets up early in the morning, takes care of the things that needs to be done, gets the cow's milk, the food on the table, makes things nice for her husband when he comes up so that he can go and enjoy his place at the city gate. Now, the city gate is a technical term in the Bible representing where the leadership of the community gathers on a regular basis. We might call it the town hall, or the White House, maybe even. But here, City Gate was where the men came and kind of passed judgment when it needed to be done. But the good wife gets up early and works late into the night, into dark, making sure that everything is taken care of. And you can read through this poem how she does everything that you would like. She dresses her household very nicely, make sure they have the appropriate things to wear. She speaks wisdom and is a kindly teacher, or is a leader of kindness. She manages all of the affairs of the household, both financial, economic, and other things, and she gives always to her husband what he needs in order to look, I probably shouldn't use this phrase, should look good to the rest of the community. So she turns out, as this little poem, to be the ideal wife or housekeeper or house mother. But in the end, the real authority always bounces back to the man. But I think it's interesting that this is chosen for this week. Well, why? Because, and I think they're going back to what I mentioned earlier on in our talk, to the use of talents. See, so let's tell this story about this noble woman who uses her gifts well, all of them, whatever they happen to be, and therefore she exemplifies what is a good and faithful use of the talents or gifts that you have received. So I think that's why this little section from the book of, or latter part of the book of Proverbs is given for our consideration today. I think the church fathers liked the idea when they chose these readings of that allegorical interpretation of talent. And so, yes, but read through, if you would, chapter 31, all of the verses, and it's very nice, and I suspect that you ladies will say, that's just what my mother taught me, that's just the way I learned it, and that's the way I passed it on to my kids. And so there is a kind of wonderful praise here given to all, in a particular way here, who learn how to use the wisdom of goodness in the best way. So once again, thank you very much for being with us today, and we hope that you have a good weekend.